If you were born in Canada in the last 40 years, chances are you're never going to own a home. But it's not your fault.
Canadian Real Estate versus Little European Castles, Part 21.
You know how hard it is to qualify someone for a $700,000 mortgage at an 8% stress test?
So as I go through this insane housing crisis that Ontario is in,
neither the federal Liberals nor Pierre Poilievre is ever going to solve the housing crisis, and the reason is extremely simple to understand.
the amount of really stressful and sad situations that I've been hearing from some of my neighbors is so heartbreaking, and it's increasing how many people are beginning to lose their homes.
In Canada, home ownership has always been synonymous with financial independence, dignity, success, adulthood, responsibility. We've been conditioned as Canadians to think that real estate only ever really goes up. And for the past 30 years or so, that's typically been true.
I've heard that a lot of places are being snapped up, sight unseen, and paid cash for out of the country. And how do you compete with that?
Prices are being pumped up because of an increased demand. Foreign buyers and an estimated 30,000 people have come here from other provinces. Take a look at what's happened to prices in the past 5 years.
We've been fed this idea that owning a house was synonymous with success and your ticket to retirement. We've been told by real estate agents and politicians and mortgage brokers and your aunt and your uncle and your dad and your older brother and your older sister and anyone who has anything to say about anything that your primary residence should be your main vessel of investment. And we've been led to think that this is normal, when in reality, this is a perspective that is uniquely Canadian. In this video, we're going to take a sober look at the real estate Ponzi scheme in Canada. Have things gotten out of hand, or was this always a part of the design?
Rigged!
So there are two main mechanisms that are maintaining this status quo that we're seeing in Canadian real estate: political issues and financial roadblocks for the average Canadian. The reality of the Canadian economy is this: it's largely stagnant and it's artificially inflated by mass immigration numbers.
The whole recession, no recession, to me is sort of academic, because if it wasn't for the 3.2% population growth, we would have already been in recession. So that's the sort of the other end of that, the other side of the coin, which is population growth can be good because it sustains nominal and real GDP, even if they're getting less productive. But what we see, so to me, I think that that's why the recession talk and non-recession talk to me is sort of academic, right? We know GDP per capita is shrinking 5-6 quarters in a row, and if it wasn't for this massive influx, we would have already been contracting on a non per capita basis, on a regular real GDP basis.
Now, don't get me wrong, immigration is a good thing and it's a necessary thing for a growing economy. But something that is supposed to be one part of our economy has now become every part of our economy. And one of the biggest reasons why mass immigration has become so necessary for the Canadian economy is Canadians just aren't having kids. Statistics Canada's demographic estimates show that a rise in temporary immigration lifts population growth. Close to 98% of the growth in the Canadian population from July 1st, 2022 to July 1st, 2023 came from net international migration, with 2% coming from the difference between births and deaths. Fertility reached record low levels in 2022, with 1.33 children per woman, compared with 1.44 in 2021. Now, we can get into the chicken and the egg argument about maybe people aren't having kids because it's unaffordable, or it's unaffordable because people aren't having kids. But that's just one of the issues. We can say maybe it's because of progressive ideologies that have saturated Canadian culture.
He was so nice. He is the best hugger. He hugs you. When someone hugs you and they grab you, it was a hug.
Never fear, the Queen of the North is here. That's me.
Whether that be the dissolution of the nuclear family, high divorce rates, high abortion rates, LGBTQ, whatever the impetus may be, bottom line is Canadians just aren't having kids. So with mass immigration comes a mass influx of competition for rental markets. There's more and more people that are competing for less and less supply.
In 2017, 2% of Canada's population was made up of temporary immigrants. Now, we're at 7.5% of our population comprised of temporary immigrants.
Canadian franchisees and small businesses exploit cheap foreign labor, bringing in employees from the third world, having them live in poor living conditions, thus reducing affordable housing and entry-level jobs for the young and the elderly.
If you buy a single family home, you can never cash flow it by putting one family in it. But if you're willing to put 10 or 15, college kids in there and charge them $500 a bed, all of a sudden you get real cash flow off of that. And you have seen that. That has been an absolute dynamic.
This not only negatively affects the disenfranchised, it also expands the wealth gap in Canada. And then we have the Canadian post-secondary scam. Large swaths of corner store community colleges that are offering student visas as a veiled form of a pathway to permanent residency into Canada, ultimately exploiting people who are wanting to leave their countries for a better opportunity. When they come here, they realize that opportunity doesn't exist.
This place is up, to be honest.
Colleges that recruit international students in Ontario are a scam. Let's take a look at A1 Global College in Mississauga. This is the college located in the strip mall. And here is the president, Vishal Minocha, who just so happens to be an immigration lawyer. And I want you to remember something. This is what the campus looks like, with bars on the window and the front door. But if you go to the Our Campus section of their website, this is what you see. They are recruiting international students from India, from China, from other countries across Asia, and they're saying to them, wow, look at this amazing college you can come to in Ontario. And so some people genuinely get suckered into coming here.
It's also extremely difficult to get building permits to build more supply to create more affordable housing. Not only that, but a large percentage of the cost to build new housing actually goes to permitting and fees and taxes, thus making new housing starts extremely sensitive to rising and fluctuating interest rates, making many of these large housing projects unprofitable for developers. This all translates to an extremely short-supplied and expensive and competitive housing market in Canada. Now for the financial roadblocks for average people like you and me. Let's talk about high borrowing costs for a second. And no, I'm not necessarily just talking about mortgage rates, but I'm talking about how a mortgage works. Let's say you have a $1 million mortgage, which won't even get you a detached home in most Canadian cities. And let's just assume you have an extra $250,000 tax-free dollars kicking around. Or let's just assume your parents have an extra $250,000 tax-free dollars kicking around. Or let's just assume your parents are willing to pull $250,000 worth of equity from their house. And let's say on average you pay a 4% interest rate for the duration of your 25-year mortgage. By the time your mortgage is paid off, you would have paid $1,578,060.62. That little 4% interest rate translated to over 50% of the total cost of your mortgage. Not to mention, mortgages are front-loaded with interest, meaning you actually pay off more of the interest than the principal for about the first half-ish of your mortgage. Your monthly payment on that mortgage would be roughly $5,200, translating to over $60,000 a year after tax-free income. In 2022, the median income was $70,000 before taxes. Most people justify this with the mantra that, well, real estate always goes up, and by the end of my mortgage term, my house will be worth more than I had actually paid, especially over a period of 25 years. But again, this idea that your house is just going to increase in value forever is largely a Canadian idea, and not even an idea in every Canadian city. Case in point, Calgary, which has basically been stagnant between 2007 and 2019, being so heavily dependent on the oil and gas sector. There are also barriers in place in Canadian lending which we're told are meant to help us and protect us, but really just protect the institutions. Case in point, the mortgage stress test. Now, in theory, this sounds like a reasonable thing to prevent the banks from lending money to a bunch of people who might not be able to pay their mortgages back. But in reality, this is easily subverted by having a parent or someone else co-sign a mortgage application, which according to the study by Statistics Canada, about 60% of young Canadians are doing exactly that. So in essence, these are just risky mortgages that otherwise wouldn't qualify, and the lenders are banking on the equity that the parents had already built up. Another thing to understand about the Canadian real estate market is it's largely speculative. Many people buy these products called pre-sale condos, where essentially they give a down payment on a condo that hasn't been built yet. The developer pools all of this money together so that they can then get funding from the bank to build the building. Most people buying pre-sales are buying them under the pretense that the property would have increased in value drastically by the time it's actually built, because again, this is typically the case. One caveat: you don't actually have to qualify for the whole mortgage loan when you buy the pre-sale condo. Another caveat: you don't actually ever have to take possession of the condo. You can take your pre-sale contract and sell it to another, typically investor, before the condo was ever actually built. Every time it changes hands, increasing and becoming worth a little bit more money. You could purchase multiple pre-sale assignments, never having any intention or ability to qualify for the loans at all. And with this happening in little pockets all over major cities in Canada, it's naturally contributing to lack of supply and an increase in price. So with all of this going on in Canada and obviously making the country less and less affordable on a near daily basis at this point, why doesn't anyone do anything about it? Well, because they want to tax it. Generation Squeeze, which is a think tank of the Canadian Liberal government, is proposing a home equity tax, which they're calling a price on home inequity. They're proposing a 1% home equity tax on all properties worth over $1 million in Canada. And as you and I both know, $1 million doesn't get you anything. According to their website, the surtax would only apply to the top 10% most valuable homes and won't cost 90% of Canadians a penny more. The surtax would help to disrupt Canada's addiction to high and rising home values by signaling that earnings from hard work shouldn't be taxed more than wealth homeowners gain from rising home prices while they sleep and watch TV. I predict that a tax like this in practice actually wouldn't affect property values at all. It would just in essence make it impossible for young families and the middle class to ever own property in coastal cities, all the while draining equity from retirees. The average price of a detached home in Vancouver is currently over $2.3 million, which means an annual 1% tax on that property value would be around $50,000 a year. I don't know a ton of retirees that can afford to pay $50,000 a year. So what a tax like this would actually just do in practice is force the baby boomer generation to sell their homes rather than pass them on to the next generation.
One of the things that always comes up for me is the idea that, on housing, you have a whole bunch of older folks who are living in houses that are too much house for them right now, but their connection to neighborhood, to community means that no, they don't want to move out to the suburbs or to some different city to be closer to their grandkids. They want to still live in their community's quality of life, and there is no housing that they can afford even to downsize other than staying in their big house.
We should have all seen this coming. Back in May, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the quiet thing out loud. In a rare moment of honesty, he admitted, housing needs to retain its value. It's a huge part of people's potential for retirement and future nest egg. And that's just the plain reality of it. We've become so drunk on real estate gains, we can't get off of it. And to be honest, guys, the Conservatives aren't off the hook either.
Before Trudeau, housing was affordable. And after Trudeau, it will be affordable again.
Pierre Poilievre has been campaigning hard on this idea to slash red tape and build as much affordable housing as possible. He doesn't really make clear whether that's affordable rental housing or if that's making home ownership affordable. But I think it's safe to say that his audience assumes he's talking about making a pathway to home ownership accessible for people like us. And here's why that's never going to happen. If Canada was to build the amount of housing it would actually need to stabilize the housing market and make houses more affordable for more Canadians, naturally that means that the value of the current housing supply would have to drop. So let's take the Lower Mainland of British Columbia for an example. In June, the average detached home price increased 9.2% year over year to $2.34 million. Now let's say this average house now became affordable for the average family, bringing it down to around the $800,000 range, which is in line with shelter ratios and average incomes. That would be absolutely catastrophic for the Canadian economy as a whole, especially when you consider statistics like this, which shows that housing represents nearly 40% of all Canada's GDP, or that Canadians have more mortgage debt combined than the economic output of the entire country. Now you gotta think, if Dad bought a detached house in Vancouver in 1984 for $50,000, and now that house is worth $2.5 million and it's paid off, well, not only is that mom and dad's ticket to retirement, they've also pulled equity from this to help Timmy buy a house, and Jane buy a house, and whoever else, maybe a boat, maybe an investment property, maybe a lake property. Point being, very rarely do people build equity and leave it in the asset that has accumulated the equity. Canadians are grossly in debt, and any sort of correction back to the realm of affordable in the Canadian housing market would create irreparable damage. And politicians aren't stupid. They know that. But they also know how disgusting and unaffordable and unrealistic and unreasonable this whole thing has really become. And they know you feel hopeless. And they are more than willing to exploit that. If you're saying to yourself, well, Canadian real estate, it's blue chip. This is all bad and true, but it's still going up. So should we just temper our expectations and pool our money and still aim to be homeowners? Because prices are going to just keep going up forever. Well, that's a great question. Enter stage left, quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is a monetary policy action where a central bank purchases predetermined amounts of government bonds or other financial assets in order to stimulate economic activity. If you don't understand what any of that means, It essentially means an increase in the money supply. So to put it in really simple terms, the more money that's in circulation, the less your money is actually worth. $1 is only worth $1 in labor relative to the total amount of money in circulation. So if there's $1 million in circulation, a dollar is worth 1/1,000,000th of the total money supply. If there's a billion, it's 1/1,000,000,000th. A trillion, 1/1,000,000,000th, and so on and so on and so on. This is why Bitcoin has become so popular, because there's a limited amount, a finite amount of Bitcoin available, which means your one Bitcoin can't become diluted by increasing the amount of Bitcoin in the circulation. The same can't be said for every major economy in the world with a centralized bank, because every major economy in the world runs a deficit, which means the government borrows from the centralized bank, thus increasing the money supply, thus making your money worth less. So if we look at the historical bull run in Canadian real estate in the last 30, 40 years, it's not that the houses have actually increased that much in value, it's that our money is actually decreased that much in value. Inflation is a killer, it's a silent tax. That's why you hear Grandpa say, back in my day, I could buy a Coca-Cola and go to a movie and get a popcorn for 5 cents. And now that's going to cost you over $50. Counter argument you'll typically hear from Canadian real estate agents or mortgage brokers is that, well, Canada is a young country and it has a lot of runway and a lot of room for growth. Look at Hong Kong. Look at Manhattan. Bro, have you ever been to Manhattan? Surrey is not Manhattan. Japan's economy and housing market was actually in a similar situation to what Canada is in now back in the 90s. They had very expensive housing, limited supply, and an aging working population. One thing they didn't have was mass immigration.
After the 90s, home values in Japan started going down and almost leveled off in the 2010s, showing only weak signs of recovery from there. So what exactly happened here in 1990 to cause things to come crashing down? Well, it was what economists call Japan's 1990s credit crunch. The Bank of Japan tightened its monetary policy by raising interest rates, trying to curb a recent inflation bubble in the late 1980s. This made it harder for the Japanese to get loans to buy houses. The lower demand made prices drop, and it was pretty bad. If a Japanese person bought a house in the 1990s for, say, the equivalent of $100,000, that house would have been worth just a little over $53,000 in 2010.
So in conclusion, the main reason why most Canadians, like you and me, will never own a house in Canada is because of greed. The politicians that say they want affordable housing are lying to you. We've become so drunk off of mass immigration and this real estate lottery that we're never going to let it go until one day we're forced to. And unfortunately, hardworking people in the middle class are going to pay for it. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and show some love to this baby channel that I'm trying to grow here and our growing community. And as always, the truth will set you free during these strange times. We'll see you next time.